falling forth from ancient pastures, green and hoarding humour, onto shores that perished sooner than the tide could come back in, gazing up at the unscalable cliff, the descent from which had promised such fun, and had been fun, dreaming of grazing again.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Solacene. This is the 15th episode in our nature series, and I would like to thank Aaron for opening us with a beautiful poem. Did you write that?
Yes, I did. You're welcome, Alicia. That's a poem that's, it kind of references like the mythologized image of the Golden Age, the Garden of Eden, or the pastoral Arcadia, from which our society has kind of gradually tumbled. And, and the idea of like us looking back up at that and thinking like, wow, that was a really nice place, which obviously is a little bit pseudo-historical, like it's not really accurate, but I think in terms of this semester, in terms of nature, the pristine wilderness that perhaps once was, it is actually, kind of accurate. So today's episode is kind of playing into that a little bit, because our question for today is something like, how could the climate crisis have been averted through the use of time travel by us? And we're kind of using climate crisis as shorthand, or I was anyway, just for all big anthropogenic environmental issues, not just temperature change, but also like extinction and habitat loss and pollution and other things like this.
The destruction of nature. How could it have been avoided if two Solacites got their hands on a time machine? So the premise of Solacene is basically imagining an ideal future that is beautiful, sustainable, and tactile.
Yep.
So we're trying to basically, what if the podcast was around 300 years ago is kind of the idea. And I think it'll be a fun conversation.
Yeah, I think that like we're 15 episodes into the nature semester, and it has been a little bit challenging, I think, for us to breach the discussion of climate change, like legitimate fixing the issues of today, because it's like it seems a little bit counterintuitive for the concept of Solacene as you just described it. And it's like, and there's also the fact that I think people can listen to other podcasts for that kind of thing. Like we're not going to really say anything insightful on those topics, I don't think, or anything that people haven't really heard that much, in my opinion. So this is kind of our creative way of doing it, of like creating, a pseudocene. It's like the Solacene of the past. And the episode was inspired by, I think it was either last week or 2 weeks ago on the episode, on the podcast, you said, 2015 or 2014, when things went wrong. And so we were kind of like, well, when did things actually go wrong? Like in terms of the environment and in terms of nature. And I'm sure we have different answers for that, because we haven't really talked a lot about our individual responses to this question for the episode today. So we might be in wildly different places. And I'll say it was also inspired by our recent watching of Doctor Who, which is a time travel TV show. And I'll say that the idea first came into my head a few years ago watching another movie, Tenet, Chris Nolan's movie, because spoilers for Tenet, people who haven't seen it, I think it's like 3 years old now, but still, if you don't want to be spoiled, skip ahead a couple minutes. The premise of that movie, we learn at the end of it, the villain kind of gives this monologue that says the reason he's trying to blow up the world or existence or, some dust or explosion is because the sea levels rose and the future became so horrible to people due to climate change that it would have been better just to end the world. And so they are sending back things in time to kind of preempt this by just ending it all. And we watched that and we're like, it's a creative concept, but what if it was more optimistic and the people from the future were just sending back things that could stop climate change and make a better future? Like that's a more hopeful film. So that's kind of what we're trying to do today, I think.
Yeah, that's basically what this whole project is, that you don't turn into a Thanos or a Tenet villain, in that you're like, let's just get rid of half of the population, that'll solve all the issues, because I guess technically it would, but the idea of the Solacene is for climate activists or people who are even just creative or like anyone, to just have like an outlet to think of like fun ideas, because it's like 50% of the things we mentioned on here aren't going to be remotely practical, but they could inspire something practical, or it's sci-fi, and then sci-fi can become reality, as we've learned through history.
You mean my idea for the city-scoped air fresheners?
Yeah, I think about those often.
Solacene recommend for this week. I didn't really have like a piece of art to recommend. You can mention one if you if you'd like, but I was thinking just Solacene recommends bundling up. Solacene
Would you like
recommends...
to give us some information behind that, Aaron, or just gonna...
Yeah, well, Montreal has been historically cold, at least in our lives, like very cold. It's been like minus 37 or whatever with the wind chill.
Yeah.
And there was some frostbite incidents. So bundle up. That's all I'll say.
You're not better than the cold. The cold will freeze the ice crystals in your skin.
What I wrote on my skin, on my paper was, humble thyself before nature.
Yes.
So
Solacene recommends layers.
But I also think, okay, that's an okay in to the discussion of the episode, because I wanted to kind of preface everything with the idea that, like, I know seems like it's being pedantic towards the exercise, but there is kind of a futility to going back and trying to change things like that, because I think that there's a degree to, like, environmental issues where the species had to make these mistakes.
Yeah, it was inevitable to
learn
an
from
extent.
Them. Kind of like me with the frostbite. It's like you had to get bitten a little bit to learn to take it seriously.
Yeah, I think that's completely true, because I was on a few forums, which I hope to never come across again, about time travel and, like, this question. It was like, well, you'd create a paradox because then jet fuel wouldn't have been created and there wouldn't be these, like, you wouldn't be able to. And it's like, okay, just for fun. And I'm sure the people who posted on there were just for fun. But of course there are some things. And, like, of course, at the end of the day, you could solve all these issues, but just different people would come along and, like, change
that's what
them.
I was thinking.
But it's still kind of fun to learn from the past for our future.
Well, I think it's a genuinely, like, educational exercise to look back and be like, well, where exactly could things have diverged to be more interesting? And obviously there's, as you just mentioned, there's, like, the butterfly effect where you might end up creating something even worse, which is like, yeah, it could happen. And I think there's also the idea that if you go back as, like, a soothsayer from the future saying, this is going to happen, guys, one, there were probably a lot of people already saying that. Like, we like to think that a sustainability consciousness kind of emerged in the 1970s or something like that. But I think really it's been around for a very long time. It was just sometimes quite fringe, or maybe it was at the core of a story or a religion or something. So you don't really recognize it for what it is. And people make the mistakes despite hearing this. And even science, it's like scientists were talking about the dangers of certain industrial things for, like, a long time, but people did them regardless. So something that I kind of tried to focus on a little bit is not just where to go back or when to go back and change things, but how would I do so and how would I prove, like, what would I bring back from the future? Yeah,
I think it's a fun concept.
Anyway, you can start.
Yeah, where I wanted to start was where all conversations start for Solacene is cars. Because here at Solacene, we are not sponsored by cars.
Yeah.
Whatever the opposite of sponsorship is, we are like, maybe they're trying to pay for our podcast to be demoted. Yeah, the big car.
They're suing us.
Yeah. But basically, I said I'd go back and instead of Ford making the assembly line of the gas-powered vehicles, I would do electric vehicles.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't know this. I was kind of shocked. Electric vehicles, EVs, were around since 1830.
Okay.
The first motorized vehicles were powered by batteries, which I didn't know. And I was like, excuse me? We had cars 53 years before we had gas-powered cars? So the first cars were powered by batteries, but obviously we didn't have rechargeable batteries right away. So, like, it was equally unsustainable.
It was a one and done.
Yeah, it was like a parlor trick, as they described it. But by 1859, they had rechargeable batteries. So they just had electric vehicles. And of course, we are using coal to power grids. But I'll get to that later, in that we also didn't need to have coal powering the grids. So I'd go back and say all EVs. Of course, that would have caused other issues, but I feel like that's a good place to start.
Mining.
It's just not...
Mining for the batteries, I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is start with the cars. Start by saying no stink chariots, just electric ones.
I'm surprised because we would still get the same highway dominated, like, infrastructure and, you know, car cities and things like this.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'm going to get to that in my my paradigm shift situation.
Okay.
But I'm like, okay, this technology is never going to come into existence, and Ford would maybe produce electric vehicles instead of gas-powered ones, because I think cars are cool to an extent for, like, fire vehicles, emergency vehicles. Like, they have technically a role.
Perhaps buses.
Buses, exactly. like in the Solacene, there'll be buses, there'll be trains, there'll be
Right.
ways of getting around other than on your feet, because like it's nice to be able to see lots of the world. But starting with, that's my step one.
So you are basically going back in time to stop the combustion engine for cars, which I feel like might also have stopped it for planes.
Yeah.
So might be a big like ripple effect there.
That's what I was thinking. Just no
Okay.
combustion engines. That's never discovered.
Sure. Okay. My first one, I was thinking, if I can move on to my first one. Nuclear came to mind as the first thing, like stopping nuclear disasters.
Yeah.
Because if we could do this, then public opinion maybe never sways and governments stop, or governments continue the construction of it. That kind of stopped, like worldwide. There was a big effect in Chernobyl, which was obviously in 1986, which strengthened a lot of the anti-nuclear kind of sentiment that had been growing in a lot of the world because of previous incidents. There's been like over 100 serious nuclear accidents.
Yeah. So if you could stop them all, though, or maybe bring back technology to like teach them how to stabilize them a little better.
I was thinking, so the ones I was targeting was obviously Chernobyl, just because it was so disastrous, and especially disastrous for like, because the spectacle of it, in a way, and also 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania in the USA. And I read this article that said that after 3 Mile Island, which was in 1979, United States public approval of nuclear dropped by about 15%. So it was like 60-something to like 40-something, which doesn't sound like that big a thing. But that was just kind of in the general sense, like, how do you feel about nuclear? So roughly 40% of people were thinking it was okay. So the majority were against it. But in terms of specific cases, how do you feel about us constructing new nuclear power sites? How do you feel about one beside your town? You know, like that kind of NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, that grew like, I don't even think you'd be able to quantify that, because obviously the image of it now was like some destructive, awful force that humans couldn't control. So I think that going back and preventing these and teaching them about what went wrong, how to fix it, maybe better cooling ways. Like, I'm not a nuclear physicist, so I'm not going to speak about the individual disasters and the like mechanisms of the reactors and how that could have been, how exactly these things could have been prevented. But I think if they were prevented, I mean, energy production would have been a lot better than it became.
It would have bought us close to 100 years of like figuring things out technology-wise and trying to change people's minds. So it definitely would have been good. I'd never have believed that nuclear is a good thing overall. Like, in the Solacene, I don't picture there being nuclear, but I do think it could have been, had there been no disasters and it was safe, then like really it would have been a good, transition fuel. Yeah. Because I don't think we should be using natural gas as a transition fuel, but with nuclear, it is technically
clean energy.
Yeah. So I think that's a cool spot. I didn't talk about nuclear because I'm pretty anti-nuclear just because of
renewable, like solar and wind and stuff like that. Yeah. No, I thought about that. I was also thinking like, I guess it just came to mind first because I was thinking especially about public opinion and not just about emissions. I was like, these were very big spectacles. It was like people were gung-ho for, you know, like talking generally, and afterwards it's like everybody, like maybe not our generation, because I think we're kind of like, I wouldn't say more educated, but we went around during those things, so it's like we're less averse to it kind of instinctively. But like I think most older generations, like my parents are, every time nuclear comes up, they'll always be like, oh no, this is terrible, you know, like that's ridiculous. And I think that was just a lasting effect that it had that was really for the worse. But then I was thinking about like some ripple effects. So there was the initial big decrease globally after Chernobyl, and before that, federally in the United States after the 3 Mile Island. It was something like 51 reactors were cancelled in the next 5 years after 3 Mile Island. So it's like a big deal. But also, it kind of helped bolster a lot of environmental organizations in other countries because it was such a big thing for awareness. Like in Germany, I saw, because of Chernobyl, that's what made them create their federal environmental ministry. So it's like it wasn't all bad is what I'm saying. So stopping it, that was just an idea for how the ripple effects could be not so great. Yeah,
for sure. I was My next thing was about, these aren't really in order, so just bear with me.
Okay.
The next thing is about the current wars between Tesla and Edison, based on, was that a movie or was that a Doctor Who episode?
The Prestige? The movie,
Prestige?
I think.
Yeah. So basically, Nikola Tesla, he was around 1900 until later on. So he was way before the environmental movements as we know it, but he basically designed a bladeless turbine. He was a big pusher of alternating currents, which over distances less than 1,000 kilometers for like transmitting electricity are way more effective because there's less loss. So it's like you turn it on and off as it's demanded. Whereas Thomas Edison, was a proponent of direct current, which is just pumping electricity all the time. And at the end of the day, Edison won out, and most of the power grids in the United States are direct current. But the reason he won, this is the crux of what I would try and change,
Okay.
and it's a bigger issue, so this is a good example of it, is he just had more marketing power behind him, basically. He had a big conglomerate of, like, rich people behind him marketing his techniques, and he was kind of lobbying the government to, like, put their money into this, and he won. And then Tesla, who had basically been trying to harness Niagara Falls, and, like, basically Tesla also believed in free energy for all, so he was very progressive, radical man, but he lost because he didn't have the money behind him. And so this is like a very small example. I think the power grids would have been designed completely differently at the end of the day if we could do it now. But the money behind bad technology.
Okay.
Because it's like in the myth of capitalism, we'll call it, is that the best technology would technically win. It's like the competition is good because it'll cause people to keep evolving. But I think that's just a myth in that you could have a really garbage technology or like a relatively garbage technology. But if you have the marketing techniques and the connections and so on, then that would win out. So the example of Tesla and Edison is that the worst technology won out. And I think if I could go back in time, I would explain to regulators or the people who were choosing like these different people bidding for the public contract of being in charge of building the power grids, I would advise the government to not allow things that are supposed to be in the public interest to be lobbied or to be pushed ahead just because they have more people behind them or more money behind them.
Because that might have the ripple effect of stopping like fossil fuel lobbying as well, and just various other capitalist interventions in what would otherwise be best for the people.
That's what I was thinking. And my head kind of went to like the drug industry, and that is like, you shouldn't have people selling drugs to the public because you can't actually trust them.
Big pharma.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, I think it would have a ripple effect on a lot of these other things that are big issues now. And because this was kind of at the turn of the millennia, I just thought it would be a good,
I feel like a more straightforward way would be to go back and kidnap Edison. Or...
what are you going to do? Electrocute him?
Yes.
Whoops, there was a mistake in the alternator.
Right.
Poor Edison.
Should have used the AC, not the DC.
Yeah. And I forgot about him going around and showing these exhibitions where he would electrocute animals.
Wasn't Edison don't people just say he was a bit of a hack now all around?
Yeah.
I'm not really sure how true that is. He might be an American hero. I don't know.
Yeah, but then also I remember Tesla was kind of chalked up to being a hack in his later life because he was like talking to pigeons and stuff.
He was a very esoteric man.
Yeah.
I know that. I do think Doctor Who might have covered it in a latter stage episode that I didn't see. Anyway. Speaking of the Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla feud, the current wars as you would call them, the organism of the week for today.
What a good drawing, Aaron. It's an ant.
Thank you. It's the black garden ant, the common black ant. I'm sure you've known this guy for a long time.
I have.
Latin name Lasius niger, I think. And do you want to guess what kind of ant, like in the black garden ant society this is? There's 3 different types.
There's worker ants.
Yes.
I don't know the other types
The
of
queen.
ants. Queen.
The queen ant.
And are
one
there
per
like the
nest.
aristocrat?
And the males.
The males.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to guess that this is a queen ant.
This is the worker ant.
Okay.
It's just like the basic.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you recognize it?
It's hard to tell with the scale.
It's a very
With
big
no
one.
scale given.
What would you do if there was actually an ant just this size and I was just holding it up like this?
I'd be pretty freaked out, honestly.
Anyway, so the black garden ant, larger colonies, they can reach up to, do you want to guess how many workers?
1 million.
No, 40,000. That kind of makes it seem a little bit underwhelming. 4,000 to 7,000 is the average.
Okay.
The worker ants, they live usually just a few months to a year. The males, they live usually just a few weeks.
Aw.
The queen, do you want to guess how long she usually lives for?
A year.
Average is like 14 years, I think.
What?
Yeah.
A
The
14-year-old ant?
The longest one was like 29 years. That's what I saw online. Yeah.
That's like creepy.
Right.
I don't like that. They have wisdom. They're going to be smart.
Quite a lot about ants.
Okay, tell me about ants.
So they mate on the wing. The queen ant and the male ants, they mate flying. Male ants all have wings.
Okay.
So every worker ant is a female.
Wow.
Which I didn't know.
Feminists. Feminist icons, the ants.
Right.
Love that.
The queen ant kind of, after the mating, holes up, or holes down, should I say, and digests the wings.
Okay.
Digest the wings. The male ants, they're basically just like flying sperm.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. Anyway, this is just one of over 12,000 ant species.
Mm-hmm.
And they are present on every continent except Antarctica. And what an irony that is.
Yeah, it is.
Antarctica. That's all.
Did you write down that pun, or did you just come up with it?
No, I wrote it. I put the
Okay.
ANT in all caps. So
I see.
I'm always kind of nervous that, because we're on YouTube, for people who don't know, if you're listening to this on SoundCloud or Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can find us on YouTube. I think my notes are kind of in the shot.
Yeah.
So I feel like people will kind of read upside down my tiny puns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always worry they're going to read upside down my typos because I can't spell.
Do you still have your, like, very aggressive notes? Do you still do those?
Aggressive notes?
Remember you used to write with, like, sound effects and stuff?
No.
Like a lot of exclamation points, and I think some swearing even.
Oh, yeah. Those used to happen. Let me just give a quick...
In high school.
Yeah. They get pretty... Yeah, all the ones here are pretty neat.
Mine is just dense.
Mm-hmm.
And penciled.
Yeah. So my next thing is my favorite conspiracy theory, which I would go back, learn about, and then maybe just stop.
Flat Earth.
So... No, it's not fully conspiracy, but it's also not fully reality.
Fake birds.
But no. Is that General Motors went and created this company, in air quotes, called the, like, streetcar company. And they went around, they bought up a bunch of streetcars, so, like, trams and stuff, which were affordable public transit. And then, within a year or two, closed them all down in hopes that it would force people to buy cars. And in a post-war trial, they were convicted of conspiring to monopolize, which is illegal in North America. You can't monopolize an industry. But they were conspiring to by getting rid of the streetcars. And it makes me angry because I like streetcars. And it's like, at the end of the day, buses are technically better for the environment and just easier to, like, replace and stuff.
You mean trams?
Trams, yeah.
I love a tram.
I love a tram too. But they're, like, expensive and they're a little bit bulky. But I liked the idea of trams because it's like, they're just one lane that's like cars can't drive in. So it's like there'd be fewer cars, obviously affordable public transit, but GM, General Motors, were trying to encourage people to buy cars, but also they were putting buses on the streets, and then they would be getting money from all of the bus parts.
It'd be a lot easier to make the trams driverless as well than it is to make cars or buses driverless.
Yeah, and I just think they're more aesthetic. They have a bit of...
So is this a conspiracy or did this happen?
It happened.
All right.
But the conspiracy element is that even if they didn't buy up the trams, people probably still would have wanted cars because of the autonomy and so on. But it's like, I do think it pushed a lot of people to need cars. So maybe it would have been just like a later adoption, or people would have kind of realized this is a silly thing for all of us to have cars and we could all be getting on the tram. But because it wasn't an option, it was like, oh, you can get a cheap car.
Yeah.
Gas was cheap. There was more and more infrastructure. So I would just go back and be like, by the way, guys, don't do that. So stop that from happening.
How would you stop it?
I would empower the people.
How?
I would show them a picture
Right.
of a parking garage or of like a traffic jam in LA. I'd show them the opening scene of La La Land and they'd go, we don't want to live
But
in
that
this
would be
world.
kind of fun also, though. They'd be like, everyone's always singing in the future.
Yeah, but I would show them something like that made cars look really horrendous and be like, so they're going to try and get rid of your trams. And people would be like, we don't want them to get rid of our trams. Use them to get to work every day. And I'll say, and they're also going to try and sell you these cars. They're like, well, that sounds good.
Maybe you could just talk about the number of car accidents.
Yeah.
The number of people who die by those.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I had some ideas about what I would bring back as proof as well. They're a little bit, I was going to match them to the scenario, and they kind of are, but really it's just like, what would I bring back to appear as like a wizard to people?
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is some kind of evidence of plastics or microplastics. I was thinking about just, this sounds kind of gory, but a fish that when they open it, it's just full of plastic. You know, I always find those images very effective. Or maybe like some polyester clothing in addition to that. Say, wow, doesn't this feel nice? But wait, open that fish. And I think that this is good because it targets, it's obviously an environmental concern because of all the ecosystems affected, but also it targets the human health, which is really a universal and very close to the front of our minds, like fixation. Like this is a visceral reaction. And there's an element of disgust, like when you open the fish and it's full of plastic. It's this idea that we have so polluted the oceans that we can't really healthily eat from it anymore. And also a lot of the land has plastic pollution as well, which is a big problem. Our clothes, and I could talk about the potential impacts. Obviously, this gets into a little bit of conjecture because it's not really scientifically proven what microplastics do to us. But I could just make some things up and be like, this does this. Fertility, or so, like crazy things like this. And I think people that would really scare them from plastics.
And I think now as this information comes out, because some of the things you're talking about are still like in development of like knowing if things are legit.
That's what I mean.
But it's like we're so numb to everything now that 100 scientists could come and say, by the way, everyone's going to be infertile in 15 years. And people would be like, that sucks.
I feel like they kind of might have.
They might have. Like it could
not
be
exactly to that, but I think the problem, or a lot of people would be like, well, that's good. Because there's such an anti-human, POV that people would be like, we're a scourge on the planet. We don't need more humans or whatever.
Yeah, but I think information 50 years ago that would have like rallied everyone to become activists for something. Now it's just like, well, I've heard that on Tuesday. It's just something new every day, which I don't think is bad that we're learning more.
It's too many causes now.
But it's our numbness.
Yeah. Something else I'd bring back as proof is just the satellite imagery, maybe like a time lapse of the planet going from green to gray.
Yeah.
Due to urbanization and population growth and all that. I think I was thinking about how I could show them about extinction, about different animals. And I mean, there would be ways of doing that, but I feel like this is like a massive generalization because as we've said before on Solacene, there were a lot of people in the past and a lot of different pasts. So there were like different mindsets. But I think generally we might be more empathetic to other species now than perhaps we ever were on like a wide scale. So I think if you showed them, this is the last elephant, this is the last rhino, this is the last panda, that kind of thing, I feel like it might not hit as hard as if you just showed them a wide shot of the planet, which would blow their mind in general, and say, look how green and lush it is. And then look what happens when you turn it up a little bit and it just gets this shriveled up gray ball. Yeah,
I honestly think that is more effective because people value aesthetics a bit more in like the environment that they lived in.
Yeah.
And people were a bit more subsistence. So if you're like, okay, the soil is getting degraded, like you can't even grow an orange that's like nutriently dense. And people would be like, whoa, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. And then the third thing I was like, we need to show some climate change data. Like we need to actually talk about this big issue. But I feel like data is a very muddy thing to bring back to a lot of people who were probably quite data illiterate. I think today we're still quite data illiterate. So like going back pretty much any distance in the past, it would be quite difficult to get your point across and really make people care about it.
Yeah, like saying atmospheric CO2 is at this concentration. People would be like, cool. Like, interesting. Yeah.
And they also don't maybe have the historical context to where like, oh, it's rising. Okay. Or like migrations are rising. Okay. Or if they did, then it'd be like today when it's like, but temperatures rise in the past. You know, this happens naturally, like blah, blah, blah. So I'm not really sure what to do with this. Maybe just talk about fossil fuels becoming a limited resource. Like maybe just talk about that would be the best thing, because that would make them care about it and make them look for alternatives. Be like, you know, that's going to run out soon. And they'd be like, oh, it's not infinite. Like that might be just a more effective way. When I was trying to think about these things to bring back, it was pretty much just the same way that I think today's climate change deniers, let's say, should be engaged with, which is almost to allow the whole conversation to take place on their terms, i.e. everything that such a person would want to say to discredit any data regarding climate change, just for the sake of conversation, let them believe, like, let that be, okay, like, there's no climate change, scientists made this up, blah, blah, blah. And then just talk about, but what about this time lapse of the earth going really gray? What about all these plastics? You know, what about, like, I think that is, because those things are inarguable. So that's just,
Yeah, I've always thought that there's obviously a switch to a bit more talking about how varied climate change is, talking about coral reefs and so on, which is just indisputable. You can show a picture of a dead coral reef and people are like, yeah, it's dead. But it's still almost too late. So bringing it back or re-engaging people with these images and these concepts.
Imagery is very visceral. I like that. With data, people always find a way to argue it or find ambiguities or stuff. But there's so much about today's environmental issues that is inarguable and just really common sense. Like, it doesn't require any literacy or mathematical literacy to look at it, or historical context. You can just be like, this plus this obviously equals bad. Like, I think that's very, like, that's what people should lean into.
Yeah, it's frustrating because the science was always there. Like, as the technology would evolve, there'd be people saying, this is bad. Like, there were the Luddites when it was like everything was getting mechanized and they were burning factories and whatever. It's like there were always dissenters, but they were so passionate, I feel like, that it was always like a swing in the opposite direction. There weren't often moderate people.
Well, like, for instance, environmental predictions have done a lot more harm than good for the cause, because people just say, well, that didn't happen. Florida's not underwater. You know, none of this happened. So why should I believe? You know, that kind of thing.
Or governments or companies discrediting legit science because it doesn't back their project that they're working on. So it's like, say a government was planning to build a bridge and then the environmental assessment was conducted, because everything nowadays needs an assessment, and the assessment says probably shouldn't do that. They'd just like kind of discredit it, and you can find a scientist who will support your thing. So it's a little sketchy. We were watching Beethoven yesterday, and you said, imagine before the internet the power that like experts would have.
Right.
And it's so true, but I think today, because there's so many experts, there's always going to be the corrupt ones who are also corrupt and spreading misinformation online or to their field. And I just think some kind of, I don't know how you could combat that. But I guess that's the point of the podcast, to figure out how to combat it.
So Beethoven, the 1992 dog movie, maybe that could have been our Solacene recommends. I'm not sure. What happens in it is that the vet, who's actually crooked, he's corrupt, basically tries to get this family to put their dog down for his own personal gains. I'm not going to say what it is because it's so dark.
He's going to sell the dog.
For
research, ballistic research, you could say.
Ballistic research. And it's like, because he makes this thing up about St. Bernards, they're always, you know, doing whatever. But before the internet, like, if a vet told you that today, you'd look it up and be like, no, they're not.
Yeah.
So I do think that is a great thing. And we're going to be talking about the internet. This is a little bit of a spoiler, but quite shortly in some future episodes. So
I'm excited with the internet conversations, because there's like the nature series and there's the internet series, and that just is what Solacene is.
Also, on the topic of Beethoven, I looked it up, and Chris, who played Beethoven, that's the name of the dog, he does indeed have his own IMDb page and Letterboxd page.
Good.
So,
in case anyone's interested in his filmography. I talked a little bit about deforestation, and you know when you read something, you're like, well, duh, but you just feel kind of stupid for not thinking these things. Sure. Deforestation until the 50s, like, it's always, where there's humans, there's deforestation for all of human history. Like, it's just, we cut down trees, it's how we heat our homes, build our homes, find a place to live. But in the 50s, when things started getting mechanized, and there was just, like, machines that could just clear cut, that's when it became a big old issue. And in the rainforest, people realized, oh, if we cut all these trees down, burn everything, then the soil becomes really rich for growing crops. So there were a lot of these really rapid developments, but regulations couldn't keep up with them. So I would say making mechanized cutting illegal? Yeah.
Or maybe just bringing back a VHS of Fun Gully, the Last Rainforest, and showing them.
Yeah, because it's like, I can't imagine cutting down an old growth tree. Like, these trees are just thousands of years old, bigger than anything people had probably even built up to that point.
Yeah.
And just slicing it down. But it's like, you couldn't cut these things down by hand. It had to take chainsaws and like big machines. So it's like, we'll always be cutting down trees for all of the future and all of the past. But it's like, if you have to cut it down with an axe, it's a bit different than cutting it down with a machine. So I just think some kind of information surrounding that, about maybe even how long trees take to regrow, because people always say,
I mean, wood today
regenerative.
is largely quite sustainable, actually, because they figured out like growing and stuff. It's not ideal, but it's a lot better than
it was.
I mean, there's still very bad practices today, but in the main, I mean.
Yeah.
Also, this episode, like you just said, when you were reading about the rainforest, you're like, well, duh, like this is a bad thing. And I think we have this context now, but something that I think people often kind of fall into that I wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit, is that it's very easy to blame older generations or like do it with a lot of spite even. But I think generally people were doing just what seemed natural and they were excited about new technologies. And like in this instance, they might have just been trying to feed people. Like so often, so many of these bad or, bad for the environment, let's say, developments were because we were just trying to feed more people or just trying to live longer or just trying to house people better or heat them. Like it's a humanitarian concern that people had first and foremost. I mean, it might have been selfish, profiteering or whatever, but really they're wicked problems. Let's put it like that.
Yeah. I didn't even touch on the Green Revolution, because it really was like, without the Green Revolution, millions of people just would have died and there wouldn't be the population we have today.
Yeah.
So it's just like, I didn't want to touch that because it is just so complex. But I suppose if you could go back, you could just say, okay, GMOs, I'm not against GMOs because it can just make crops more resistant to drought and so on. But it's like, once you have these certain set of seeds and these things that are resistant to crops, just not pushing the image of food as perfect. Like, you can buy at the grocery store like the imperfect vegetables, and it's always like, what's even wrong with these? Just kind of, there is a line. Like, there is a line in the Green Revolution where it's like, okay, this is good, but then when it's switched into all the marketing and the trying to sell you bottled water that's like $30, it's like, that's where it gets sketchy and then therefore exploitative and like unjust. But yeah, I won't go too much into the Green Revolution. That caused a lot of issues, but also, it was probably the most beneficial thing in human history.
Well, speaking about population growth, that was the next thing after nuclear that I was like, if we could try and limit this, go back and try and limit this in a humane way. Like, obviously, it's a contentious topic. And for that reason, I didn't pick a date or any even period of dates or any like numbers for population, because I would have just been plucking it out of thin air. But it's basically like from 1800, so like with industrialization, to today, population in the world went from something like 900 million to 8 billion, which it is today. And people talk about how 10 or 11 or 12 billion is technically sustainable. And I think that is probably true, like manageable, but this is with very low consumption. And I don't think people really want to live those lives like in general. I think an ideal population is one that has access to material goods and a little bit of land and energy that they want. And I mean, I know we want it to be renewable in the future, but also like meat, things like this. So maybe just going back, I won't say when, and I won't say where, because I'm not sure, but going back and like educating people, educating women, upping women's rights, getting better healthcare to places so that child mortality wasn't so high, birth control, all these things. Like if that had happened maybe like 100 years earlier than it all did,
Because it happened in the mid-1900s. So yeah, push it like 100 years earlier. Because that would have, and then it would have then spread to all corners of the earth, whereas now it's still spreading.
Yes.
Knowledge and like female rights, obviously. Yeah, it's not a bad thing if you're going back in time to help people realize, because it's going to cause a lot of other solutions. You're going to have the next female Einstein hundreds of years earlier than she actually was born. Like,
you talking about yourself?
Things. Absolutely not. There's just so many things about resource extraction that it's kind of just like, can lump it all together, teach people that if you overfish, the species will go extinct, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Whaling, stop all that industry a little earlier. And then the one other thing, this is the big topic that I had trouble talking about because I'm not anti-globalization, but I'm also not entirely pro-globalization. But there's different types of globalization. I think the spread of information, 100% wonderful. There's something called the technique effect, which is when a more developed country has developed a green technology to like produce something, and then they export it to the countries that they're operating in. So those are for multinational corporations that like they're maybe producing their things in China, but the company is run out of America, so they can export this green technology. So I just think there's nothing wrong with the flow of information, nothing wrong with the flow of people.
Yes.
But my issue is with the flow of resources to an extent. But I think the flow of resources goes hand in hand with people's mindset when it comes to overconsumption. So it's like, well, technically the flowers being grown in Peru are better for the environment to be imported to Canada instead of trying to grow them in the winter in a Canadian greenhouse. But it's like, that's, to me, not the issue. The issue is that we're demanding roses in the dead of winter. So it's like, you'd have to change people's mindset surrounding seasonality of their product consumption. But then I think if we can then do that, stop the demand, then the globalization of like materials would be reduced. Certainly things could still flow around. I love bananas. I think bananas are cool, but it's just like maybe there's certain times of the year where you have to forego the bananas, or if you really love them, move to a Peru, country where the bananas are grown. But I just think the globalization of production is just one of the leading drivers of unsustainability. It was also massively accelerated with the world wars because people realized, or like nation states realized, that they can just like house power over another country, or they can like work together to make things happen. But it was so rushed, and there was all this money poured into the formation of the internet and so on. And it's just like, had these things been slightly more slowly developed, they perhaps would have been developed with a bit of nuance and realizing, oh, maybe just because you can produce a Dollarama worth of products doesn't mean you should be allowed to import it to a different country, or you should do it. So it's just like stopping people's consumer mindset from getting to the point that it is today, where you think you need 100 t-shirts and so on.
That was my last point too, but I think you said it in a more concise and articulate way than I, which is impressive. So,
I spent a lot of time on that one because I'm always hesitant
to
speak about globalization because I'm at once super pro-globalization.
No, but I like the way
you
split up the globalization of resources, of people, and of ideas, or of technique, or information. Oh, that's very
Thank you.
Very neat. The only thing, like, I read this article on BBC Future, which is called "How the World Embraced Consumerism." I'd recommend that because it was a really cool like outlining of it. But is that this goes along with my frostbite analogy. I feel like it's one of those things that however many times people were maybe told in the 1920s or at the start of the World Wars, because I'm sure there were some radicals being like, you don't need all this stuff. Or that guy in ancient Greece who was like living out of a barrel, all that kind of thing. I feel like it's one of those things that a culture just needs to go through to then get to the all-white, minimalist living, all-white walls this is, and like all-white and beige minimalist living like ethos that you see taking hold now, like with Gen Z. I know there's also like the Shein and fast fashion contingent, but I there's so much more of an awareness with people younger than us than there are with people older than us, for instance. And I just feel like it's one of those things that had to have happened. So the only way I kind of tweaked what you said is that I would go back and just try and stop the plastic. I would because branding, I just feel like it's one of those things that had to happen. So taking that into account, I'd be like, how can we do this without making it all polyester and wrapped in plastic?
Mm-hmm.
And even that is kind of a riddled thing, because the development of plastics, a big part of it was that it was a shift away from materials like ivory.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, well, that was a good thing, because they stopped hunting, to such an extent, like elephants and, as you said, whales and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like plastics do some good.
Yeah, I mean, even for sanitation purposes.
Yeah,
and
sanitation.
It's like people aren't dying of
Right.
food poisoning anywhere near as much.
Mm.
And I just think there needs to be a bit of a readjustment. Like, we've overcompensated, everything hyper sterile, like that you buy at the grocery store. It's like maybe you have to wash your vegetables when you get them home.
Yeah.
Bit of a hassle, but it's like better than everything being wrapped in plastic.
Well, here's an example, like celluloid for film.
Mm-hmm.
That would not have happened if it weren't for like the plastic age or the plastic advancements. So I think that was generally a good thing. So it's a difficult conversation, but I think just in terms of saying, just stop wrapping everything in plastic, stop the single-use plastic water bottles, if we even just stop that. Like, there's so many things that just did not need to exist whatsoever.
Plastic bags.
Yeah. So I think if we could have just toned that down and gotten to this, I think, quite promising age of conscious minimalism without so almost irreparably breaking everything. The
garbage island patch in the ocean would be excellent.
Right, but imagine if we had gone to this point and it's like everyone's still lining up for the new sneakers at Foot Locker or whatever, but there's no plastic in any of it.
Yeah.
Like, that would be it would be bad socially, but maybe not so bad environmentally. And also I think we would have reached it a little bit quicker.
Yeah, I think so. So thank you all for listening. We love having these chats. Next week is probably going to be our last in the nature series, so definitely tune in for that, for us to wrap up all the loose ends.
Yeah, tune in for the big quiz.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, I'm not ready for the big quiz.
Yeah, you're going to get quizzed. Also, please subscribe.
It's very helpful. We put a lot of work into the podcast and love making it, and we really like when other people get to see it.
Or leave a comment, because we really like hearing your comments. Even if they're hate comments, I like those. I pin them up on the wall, and I do crunches looking at them.
Good. Bye, guys.